If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. Hi there. Today, I want to talk about context, and I want us to think about what does that mean? What's the definition? How does context fit into productivity? And particularly, how does it fit into task completion and task management? Anytime you talk about task management, you're talking about actually doing things, actually completing tasks. And there are multiple components to doing that. And we'll break down task completion. For example, one component of task completion is to know that you have something to do. In Attention Compass, we spend a fair amount of effort making ourselves aware that we have something to do at the appropriate time that we need to be aware. It's another thing to have that list in priority order, to focus on the important versus the urgent, and to have that list managed in ways that you're working on the more important thing when you get the opportunity. Assuming that we know we have something to do and we're confident that it's the highest priority, then there's the question of, will we actually do it? Knowing that we have a high priority task, will we actually do it? And this bridges over into the notion of procrastination, the notion of, do I feel like working on this? And even, oh, I hate that task. Am I really going to start it now? But when we think about this, one of the big deals that I don't hear anybody talk about is this notion of context. I think it's important, particularly when it comes to helping yourself do what you know you need to do. I think all of us struggle with that some days, sometimes to some degree. A task pops up and it's, do your expense report. And I'm going, I don't want to do my expense report. I don't care how disciplined you are. Some days it just jumps on you. So one of the things that I believe, and this is attention compass kind of thinking, is that we need to make it as straightforward as possible to do what we know we need to do. And I think that one of the things that goes undiscussed is this context of the work, of the task that we've got in front of us. So we're going to talk about that today. My goal is, if you understand context, then you'll choose tasks that don't have a bad context problem. And thus, you're more likely to do the task that needs done. I'm going to define what I mean by context, why I think it's important, and what we can do about it. We're going to try and orient ourselves towards actually completing these tasks and delivering these results, rather than having even small bits of interference mentally with doing the work. Now, you know that I'm very concerned about delivering results. I'm also concerned about the amount of effort we put in, but to a lesser degree. I certainly think, just to be clear, that there's real quicksand, there's real muck in this notion of, I'm just going to move this project along. And I've talked about that on a few different occasions. That's very different than actually completing the task and getting it delivered. Done as in done, D-O-N-E, delivered, packaged, shipped, the whole 9 yards. And if we can get it done, then that's the foundation of creating value in the world. We create value in the world, that's how we get paid. And that's really what's important about our work, to create that value. And that's what I call productivity. You can spend all day long doing stuff that's not valuable. And I don't care how hard you work or how many tasks you complete, it's not productive behavior. It can't be defined as productive. And many people have talked about this. You got to get the right results from your effort. By the same token, the flip side, I guess, is you can plan productivity until you're blue in the face. But unless you actually do what you've intended to do, unless you actually do the tasks, you're not productive. We're not creating the kind of value we could create. We're going to talk about all this in today's episode. Of course, in the modern workplace, a lot of us, that is almost all of us, have gotten the idea that we can work from anywhere. And that's true enough that it makes sense for us to assume that we can. But there's a couple of problems that we have to overcome if we're going to work from anywhere. Of course, the way we implement this is we want to claim that we can do our work from anywhere because that gives us flexibility and freedom, and we want that. And I'm all in favor of that, but I'm in favor of doing it well and doing it judiciously. So there's a few problems with the idea that we can work from anywhere. I think it's easiest to say that it's usually true, but not always. And I want us to understand the difference between when we think it's probably true and when it's actually true. One of the areas of challenge here is this notion of context. We've just got to recognize that all work environments are not created equal. Some are better than others. We need to realize that the intersection of this is a good work environment and the work I need to do in this environment is really important. And that's where context comes in. So I'm trying to categorize differences in work environments. I'm going to say context is one of those things, one of those differences. And then going back to work from home or work remotely, well, it's a match between the context that the work requires and the context that is available in different locations where we might want to be. And when we think about that, it becomes this matching exercise. Now, we'll talk a lot about what this is, but a work environment, and I don't want to say location because location is only a part of it, really. A specific work environment has context to it, and a task requires certain context. So if we can match, if we can make the task context meet the environmental context, then in my view, we're going to get better productivity and less impedance to our work. If there's a mismatch between the required context from the task and the available context, which is the environment, then we're going to have to deal with that. But it's either going to slow us down or drain more energy than it has to. And both of these interfere with maximizing our productivity. An example of context, the grocery store. You have grocery kinds of tasks to do, and those tasks are best done in a certain context. And that context is there's food stuff that you can select from, and there's a mechanism for you to exchange dollars for the stuff. And the grocery store provides that context. Also, an example of mismatch between contexts. We have Publix grocery stores where I live. And so if I go to the Publix, I can buy lots of groceries. But if I go to the Publix expecting to buy tires or a new suit, then I'm in the wrong context. And that's a pretty blatant example of a well-known context. We know the grocery context. We don't typically expect to have a sit-down lunch when we're at the grocery store. And that's how this context thing works. I'll give another example of context. Is your phone available and usable in the context? Your task is, I need to make a phone call. Well, is your phone available to you in the context? Another question is, to what degree is it available? Now, I'm using a phone example here because it's one thing to have the device with you, but that's just table stakes for making a phone call. There's a little bit more to it than that. It's a little more nuanced. The one nuance, if you have your phone with you, but you're standing in a train station, it's going to be really hard to have a decent phone call. If a jackhammer fires up just down the block from where you happen to be sitting, you're going to have a tough time with a phone call. And so there is some nuance here. And we'll talk about all of these different categories and aspects of context. Another thing with the phone in particular, and this is a different nuance, and I've mentioned it before, but I'm going to take this opportunity to mention it again. With the phone, you can make a call, but should you? Now, I think that's a context question as well. What else is in this environment where I'm trying to make the phone call or take the phone call? What else is going to have a claim on my attention? Of course, the canonical example is driving and talking on the phone. In many, many cases, you're driving, you've got all the spare attention you need to have a conversation on the phone, but not always. I think having business conversations, customer kinds of conversations is not a great idea here. And I'm on record with this, so I won't beat this to death. But if you're going to try and capture information while you're on the phone and driving, you're going to have a hard time with it. So this is this nuance of context, and we'll drill down on how to think about it. So let's make sure we've got the good, bigger picture. Let's zoom out. Okay, that's fine. What does all this have to do with productivity? When we're prioritizing our tasks, I think we might tend to overlook this notion of context, and I don't want us to do that. I want us to think carefully about it and build a habit around thinking about it. Because if we overlook context, then I think it harms our productivity with the task. For example, if I'm making a phone call in a noisy place, I have to repeat myself multiple times, then that phone call is going to, one, take longer than it would have in another environment, and two, the information is going to have a tendency to get garbled because of the noise. Both of these are decreases in productivity, and I'm creating productivity issues for myself. When we think about this, we've got to recognize that context is adjustable. It's malleable. We can interact with our environment to create more of the context that we're looking for. If you're in an office and you need to make a call, then you can get up and close the door, decrease the amount of noise, or you can move to a different location. We do this a lot, and at some level, we do it instinctively. But we do have some control over the environment. It's also changeable to some greater or lesser degree. Now, this idea has a couple of concerns that come along. One is there's a little bit of risk because the context can change on us. You're sitting on a park bench fixing to have an important call, and you don't realize this, but just over the crest of the hill, about 100 yards from you, they're working on the sidewalk, and they're about to start jackhammering it up. So you get on the call, and pretty soon the jackhammer starts. So the context has changed on you. So there's always some small amount of risk here, and then we have to adjust to that if it changes. That's one side of this malleability of the context. It can change on us, but also we can change it. When we think about changing the context, we need to think about the cost. What's the cost of creating the context that we need to have, and can we minimize that cost? When I say cost, of course, I'm not necessarily talking about dollar cost, although that is a possibility. For example, a lot of people spend a lot of money to have a private office so they can have a particular kind of context and have it consistently. One question that pops up when we change contexts, are we having to task switch? Are we having to go to great lengths to change the context? We're trying to create a context in an environment that really doesn't have it naturally or doesn't suit it. So just a couple of ideas about why context is important and how it works with us and for us. Going back to these challenges, I alluded to this a little bit before. If we're in the wrong context with a task, that is, if there's a mismatch between the task's required content and the content that the current environment presents, and then we do the task anyway, we're going to feel some obstacles to doing it. We're going to feel some resistance, like our work is harder than it might otherwise be. We might have subpar results. And it's like before, when we were talking about having a phone conversation in a very noisy environment, you don't hear the communication as well as you might have otherwise. And so it can be garbled. You can have to ask for repetition, or you can think you heard something and actually have heard it incorrectly. All these kinds of challenges. But we can and do try to force the work into the current context. So we have to be careful doing it. Now, yes, sometimes we have no choice. We have to do the work where the work is available to us. The term battlefield surgery comes to mind. But that really should be the exception. And if it's not, then I think we probably want to look into our planning a little bit. And we'll talk about that towards the end. How do we incorporate this idea of context into our planning? But first, let's do some definition. When I look at the notion of context, for me, it divides into 5 components or subcategories or aspects, if you will. They are 1, physical. That's the hard environment we're in. Are we in an office? Are we in a car? What is the building around us? What's the environment around us? Another one is energy level. And this is interesting because the energy level is about us. Okay. To some degree, an environment may energize you or drain your energy, but mostly it has to do with us in the situation. So this is a little bit nuanced because it's not necessarily about the hard environment. It's likely that we bring our energy level to the environment with us, but I still categorize it as a component of context, and we'll think about that and how that works. There's also a mental, almost emotional component around context, and we'll talk about what that is and what it means. And then there's a quasi-physical component, and that is not the hard environment, but the soft environment. Or are the tools available that I need? And then the 5th one is the social component. And social has a lot to do with, are the other people I need around me or available when I'm doing this task? Can I access the other people that I need? So we'll detail on those so that we understand them better. And we want to think about them as we're deciding on the tasks to do or when to do a task. The physical component of context, and that's the noise level, the likelihood of interruption. If you're going to be doing the task for a long time, is there a chair for you to sit in? What's the temperature? Noise level, all these physical things. And this, I think, is the easiest one to deal with most of the time. It's the one that we're most comfortable with. And I think we think about this one the most, assuming that we're thinking about context at all. We know we don't need to be having phone calls in a rock concert. We know that and we deal with it. So that first component, and that's why it's first, is the physical, and we think about it. It's reasonably straightforward. But we still need to build the habit of thinking about it. Maybe that's an easy introduction to this notion of context. The second one we talked about is energy level. The easy way to think about energy level is this notion of, are you a night owl or are you an early bird? And if you identify that, then your energy level is a part of context that relates to time. So how do we schedule tasks for that energy level? Now, there's another really interesting component here that's not this rhythmic, it's not this morning or evening component, but it's the notion of, given what else has happened recently, what's your energy level now? Another way to say it is, what's the history of your energy use today? As an example, if you think about physical energy, you probably don't want to schedule mowing the grass immediately after you finish running the marathon, because your energy level is not going to be what it should be. This other energy thing is similar. If you've had a high stress morning, then it may have sapped and drained your energies, so much so that in the afternoon, when you go to do this other challenging task, you just don't have the energy level that you might need to do it. And that's something we think about as well when we're doing this, that this other part of the energy level. The third one we discussed is a mental component, and this captures, for example, the notion of theme days. Michael Hyatt's big on theme days along with others. He talks about the ideal week, and what he's trying to do is provide a consistent mental context for each day. He's trying to have, for example, marketing Mondays. His view is that if his mind is on marketing topics, then there's less resistance or impedance to the next meeting or the next task because he's already in that frame of mind. I certainly think there's something to that we have a sticky brain. And if we're in the mode of, say, right brain versus left brain work, we're in that mode. If you spent all day doing right brain stuff, then it's probably a good idea to continue doing right brain stuff because that part of your brain's all fired up and limbered up. There's an idea of momentum here. And I think this one in particular brings out another subtle cost of changing context. And that's this cost of reorienting our brain towards a new context. We do have this notion of momentum. I think our brains are a little sticky when it comes to tasks. Our attention certainly is sticky, but also our context is a little bit sticky. And when we try to deal with that mental component, that's a way to think about it. What other kind of work have I been doing prior to this? And is that work sticky in my head? The fourth category, if you will, is this quasi-physical environment. And this is the soft things. Are my tools available to me in the context that I'm going to be in to do this task? If we think about the work from home context, do we have the same set of tools available at home as at work? Now, here's one that used to be a big deal, but it's mostly gotten fixed. People used to pick their coffee shop based on the quality of the Wi-Fi. And Wi-Fi is a tool, and I said there's some overlap here between this and the physical environment. That's a good example. I'll give another example. My typing is much worse on a laptop keyboard than it is on a full-size keyboard. In fact, it's not huge, but it's there and it's annoying too. It interferes with my ability to do tasks. It doesn't remove me from doing the task, but it does interfere a little bit. So if I'm going to do a writing task, then I'm much better off at my desk context than at my coffee shop context. Typing speed is not the only consideration, but it's certainly one consideration. Thinking about tools available. What about the security context of your data? Can you get hold of the information or data you need to get a hold of at a coffee shop as compared to sitting at your desk in your office? Does your laptop have the same software on it that your desktop has? Does your home computer have the same software? Does your home computer have a webcam? So are these contexts the same or similar enough that we can make work portable between them? One of the biggies is a power plug available. It seems trivial, but when I was teaching at the University of Alabama in a big lecture hall, there was not power readily available, and students would really kind of arm wrestle over it. Airports, for example, used to be the worst of this, trying to find a plug at an airport. Now they fix most of this, but still something to consider. So that's 4. The 5th is this social component of context. For example, deciding between the office and the house. From the house, can you have an impromptu face-to-face? From the house, are the right people around? Are the right people available? Another social component. Do you want to go to the coffee shop where you're well known and there's liable to be an interruption or so because people are saying hi to you? Now, there's some overlap between these categories, but I do want us to have kind of a mental checklist so we can think it through. There may be more than 5 components. You may want to define them differently than I have, but the key is to define it and think about it. So quickly, for this podcast, we divided them into physical, the properties of the physical space, energy level, On one hand, it's this cyclical thing, night owl versus early bird, but there's also a sequential thing. During this part of the day, have I already used up a lot of energy? There's a mental component, and there's a little bit of context switching to it. Can we have theme days where we're doing all of our marketing stuff in one day? Quasi-physical 4 are the tools available. Do I want to do this work on my laptop versus doing it on my desktop? What's my typing speed here? And the 5th is social. Are the people that I'm likely to need going to be around where I can get a hold of them? So that's the 5 components of context. And it's a starting place to think about these things. So now I want to go back to the fact that we wind up in the wrong context from time to time. If we're in the wrong context, there's a spectrum of effects we could see. A slight mismatch between the context the task requires and the context that the situation presents is going to have a small effect on it. A larger mismatch is going to have a larger effect, of course. It's the difference between, wow, it's a little noisy for this phone call. And, well, I just got home to work from home this afternoon and immediately the power went out. Small effects can make whatever we're doing a little bit harder, all the way up to big effects that can make it close to impossible. So one problem here, at the smaller end of the spectrum, we're in the wrong context. It can be difficult to notice because the cost is smaller, it's more subtle. We might feel it as some desire not to do the task, some desire to put it off, or some, wow, I really don't like doing this, some kind of resistance to doing the work. And that may be how we feel these small differences in contextual alignment. So, are we going to run into procrastination problems with this lower level of mismatch? Something to think about. If you find yourself wanting to procrastinate a task, maybe have a quick look at the context and make sure that it's appropriately lined up, or there's some little impedances that are causing you to want to postpone the task, procrastinating. You might just have the idea, I'm just not feeling it. It's really hard to interpret energy level versus emotional. And again, we start thinking of it in terms of procrastination. Procrastination is this moral failing. We feel that way, and it makes us feel bad when it might just be a simple context mismatch and we can solve it. Emotions, feelings are hard to solve, but context is pretty easy to solve. So if you feel like procrastinating a task, maybe changing the context will help you move on through that and actually get the work. And that's really the point of this whole podcast, is for us to think about these things and use that in evaluating how we're doing with productivity and in planning our productivity. As we said above, we can see it as procrastination when in fact it's a planning problem. It's a management problem. If it is, then we need to fix it at that level rather than worrying about our motivation. Now, if you've heard my podcast, you know I'm all about actionable information. So great, this theory, how do we operationalize all of this stuff we've been talking about? In Attention Compass, we talk a lot about work blocks. These work blocks are developed during daily review, and we're building them out. And I can talk about a lot of detail about how to do this, but it's one of the things that we do in daily review and Attention Compass. And context is an important part of a work block. When we are scheduling work blocks, that's a way to manage our timing. So we put work blocks in a calendar, and these work blocks are for us to do our own work. And if you're in a shared calendar environment, it's critically important that you do this, that you put these meetings in, even if they're just meetings with yourself, because otherwise your calendar is going to get sucked up. And we've all seen this happen. In Attention Compass, in the daily review, we're building this time into our schedule, and we want to schedule work blocks with context in mind. We want to schedule work blocks that have contexts that match the needed context of the task. As an example, we're sitting down and we're doing work blocks and we're thinking, I've got a work block from 10 to 11:30 this morning. Well, what's my environment going to be? What's my context going to be? I want to take that into account when I think about the tasks that I'm going to consider putting into that work block. So I have a certain set of priorities, a certain task list, and does that match with the context? I may have a real high priority task today, and it has a context that is the most useful for this task. How closely does that match the context that's going to present itself in this 10 to 11:30 work block I've got? I believe we need to be thinking about this at least to some degree. We don't want to overplan. You can get analysis paralysis, but at the same time, thinking about it's useful. So this is the scheduling aspect of these tasks and matching the task with the context of the environment that's going to present itself at that scheduled time. Now, I will say another component, and then this sort of fits into context. We talk about sequencing work block. We talked about theme days. You hear people talk about batching tasks. Well, that's the positive sense of sequencing tasks and sequencing work blocks. In the negative sense of sequencing, we talked about energy level. And we talked about if you have a bunch of draining meetings in a row, then maybe you don't schedule the task, this high emotion task in the work block immediately following that. Maybe you need to take a break before you get into that and control that context and your energy level a bit. So it's both scheduling and sequencing. We want to think about this context into which we're planning our tasks. We mentioned there is some risk. The context may change. You might be thinking, well, I've got some important reading to do, so I'm going to go sit on a park bench and do it. Well, then the jackhammer starts up. So all of a sudden, that context is not good for the task, and we have to make adjustments to that. I think batching is a great idea. Batch your tasks if you can, all the way up to this theme day thing that Michael Hyatt, among others, talk about. Now, I think context gives us some rules or parameters for batching tasks together and thinking about all these different categories. For example, if you're going to have a theme day, can you control the context for an entire day? Or not? If not, then maybe you can't batch a whole day's worth of tasks. Now, as I said, these categories are not ironclad. They're a mental checklist, a thought tool, if you will. So we check in with each context. We say, okay, physically, this task is going to require lots of sitting down. Is there a comfortable chair? Or am I going to be perched on the corner of some ottoman for an hour and a half? And then we think about energy level. Okay, is this a high energy task or a low energy task? Does it fit into this work block? Quasi-physical. Am I going to be somewhere other than my office? Do I need to be somewhere other than my office? And so we pile all these things in and we use this checklist as sort of a prompt, a thought tool. The other really good time to think about context is when we're postponing tasks. Now, postponing is certainly part of planning. We see a task pop up and we go, well, today is not the right context for this task. And then as we look forward for that task, we put a reminder or however that works in attention compass. And while we're doing that, we're going to say, well, Tuesday looks like it'll have a good context for this task. An example, once a week, I drive to the neighboring town. I live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and once a week I go to Birmingham. And there are certain things that I can do in Birmingham, certain contexts that are available in Birmingham that are not as readily available in Tuscaloosa. For example, Birmingham has a really top-notch library. So maybe I have a task that fits that library context, in which case I'll want to look at the task and go, oh, okay, on Thursday, I'm going to be in Birmingham. Let me plan to do this library-oriented task at a time when I can be at this great library, because that's a better context. So when we're looking at that, when we're looking at scheduling, we want to think carefully about, well, what's the context going to be? And that's why I'm giving us this context structure to work with. Now, I think we do some of this instinctively, but I think if we can bring it to the forefront of our thinking, then we can think about it better. So I think bringing the idea of context into your planning arsenal is one of the key things that we can do to get better and more productive. Now, in Attention Compass, I mentioned this, we do the daily review workflow where we pull out our candidate to-do list. Now, notice that I said pull it out. I'm not writing it down. I'm not creating it from scratch. We go get it from where it is and we bring it up and we look at our calendar, and we're actually comparing the preferred context of each task on our prioritized list to the contexts that are going to more or less naturally be available in this next time period, maybe in a day. Now, all this is really baked into a Attention Compass. You've heard me talk about Attention Compass a couple of times in this podcast. And the reason that I want to bring that up is a plug for Attention Compass. And all this got thought about when Attention Compass was developed as a system. Context was a big part of the thinking that we put in, and we built in a place to evaluate context. So that's in the daily review and also in the postponement step, should we need to do that with some work. So that's one thing. And the other with Attention Compass is we're developing habits of thought around dealing with this stuff. We're developing a process. And when we have a process, then we're able to think about things clearly. We learn how to think about them a little bit better. So context is a more refined way to think about task matching than just time available. And as we're doing this thinking, it is not, Attention Compass is not slash and burn hustle culture. It's not hair on fire, Mach 3, got to get it done stuff. It's stop and consider, even just for a brief moment. And what am I doing? Is this the right thing to do next? And part of that is, does the context present itself? Priority is certainly a piece. Context is another piece. So that's the plug for Attention Compass. Of course, with all of this, if you're interested in talking about it more, discussing it, or you think I'm wrong, or you have an interesting point or an interesting story to bring up, reach out to me. You can hit me at larry@dobusywrite.com. Also, you can find me on LinkedIn, Larry Tribble, Tribble. If you connect with me on LinkedIn, though, please mention that you connected because of the podcast. And that way it'll be easier for me to accept the connection when you send it. So let's spend just a few minutes doing review and we'll wrap up here. We spent a lot of time talking about context and defining it, what's going on with context. So context is this notion that a task has certain requirements in terms of these components that we've listed. And that each environment that we're presented with, to some degree, presents a natural context. And that's how we map tasks to a time frame and or to a location. So we're beginning to match these things. Now, I mentioned, I think when we get a context mismatch, we see that as an interference with our ability, with our willingness, or with our energy level around completing the tasks. Again, it's according to this spectrum. And if the power's out, we know it's not a willingness problem. But at the smaller end, I think we sometimes feel it as willingness or energy level when in fact it's a context problem. And we talked about when we look at productivity, there are three real components of getting things done. One is, do I know what I need to do? The second is, do I know it's a priority? Am I confident that it's a high priority task and that I'm getting the most value I can? And then this third piece is knowing what the task is and that it's a priority. Am I actually going to do it? And that's where productivity planning meets the road of creating value. Am I actually going to do the task? And that, I think, is where context blends in. And we talked about this notion. Small mismatches between the task's context and the environment's context might be perceived as some emotion or feeling or something and lead us to procrastinate. And if nothing else, a mismatch is going to make the task take more time and more energy than it would in a more suitable context. So that's the challenge that we face, is get this context right so things will be as easy as possible to actually do. Now, when defining context, we talked about 5 components. There's the physical component of context, the physical environment, the hard physical stuff, chairs, desks, lighting, noise levels, all these kinds of things are there. Is there a door we can close to manage the noise? The second component is energy level. And we talked about 2 components to this component, 2 pieces of energy level. One is, I think each of us has a natural rhythm, night owl versus early bird, or however you think about that. And the other is the rhythm of the day. And that means, have I had a morning where I've used up a ton of energy and really don't have that same energy to bring in the afternoon? If so, then I need to think about that context. We've got a mental component, and that's this notion of mental momentum, of getting into a habitual mode of thinking. And this is so we can capture the good advice from Michael Hyatt and others about having theme days or batching tasks. And I think that's a great move. But if we're going to batch tasks, then the tasks need to have a similar context, and that context needs to be available when we're doing the batch of tasks. So that's a way to think about batching, is, do these tasks have a similar context? The fourth component that we talked about is quasi-physical. And that's the availability of tools and data, of inputs. Can we get to what we need to get to? And that's why it's a little bit different from the physical environment. The physical environment sort of impinges on us. It happens to us, where the quasi-physical environment is something we have to reach out into. But the idea is the information that I need available? Am I in the right data security context? Can my laptop do the same things that my desktop can do? Does my home computer do the same thing my work computer does? Is there a printer available? And if so, does it have toner? All of these questions are part of this quasi-physical environment. And just think of that as the tooling environment, or the data and information environment. And then the fifth piece is the social component. And it's named the social component because it has to do with other people. The task context Does it require other people to help me? Do they need to be available for me? Can I count on them being accessible from this context? And here we might have to play the odds, the probabilities here. So that's those 5 components of context, just for review. Now, we talked about actionable information. We operationalize this notion of context by using it as a thought tool in our planning. We don't want to get bogged down too much and overwork the planning situation, because that's a waste as well. But I think if we have a mental checklist, or even some checklist written down somewhere, just not a sticky note on the bezel of your computer. But if we have a mental checklist, at least, of the components, then we can use it as a thought tool and go down the checklist and see how it feels. So then we can build this habit of thinking about these things as we're doing our planning and as we're doing our task schedule. The big key is to avoid procrastination, and secondarily, to put us in a position where we're able to be the most effective in our work, where we're not tripping over ourselves, tripping over our shoelaces. And that's the example. Choosing the correct context is like making sure your shoes are tied before you go for a run. You don't want these little things to trip you up and slow you down, particularly as you're trying to produce value with them. So context is something to think about. Bring context into your planning. Use my list of contextual cues, or you may want to develop your own. Maybe you write all this down and have it handy while you're learning to think in these ways. Of course, when I say checklist, I'm thinking about a surgeon or the pilot of an airplane. And they're checking to make sure they're ready to do the task. Do I have all the right things that I need in order to do a good job here? And if not, then let's take care of that now before we get started, rather than waiting until an emergency crops up and having to deal with it on an in-flight basis. Let's just walk through it briefly and think about it before we get started doing it. So there you go. That's context. Now, I hope that you'll get out there and use context to help you do busy right. So I'll leave it there for now. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the attention compass process. Attention compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do busy right.